Hi everyone, this is Suvan from CRAC. Thank you all for joining us. We're gonna get started here in a little bit. We're gonna wait a few minutes for folks to join us. In the meantime, everyone is currently on mute mode. If you have any issues or have a question for us, um, you should have a taskbar that popped up, and there's an option for questions. Click that, and there should be a drop down, and you can enter in your questions there, and we'll try to troubleshoot and make sure you're on the webinar with us. All right, thanks.
Hi everyone, thanks so much for joining the National Council of Asian Pacific Americans for our third webinar on the Every Student Succeeds Act. My name is Marian Tablante, and I'm with NCAPA, and I'm just going to start it off for you all. Just a reminder that everybody is automatically on mute, and you can type in your questions at any point during the webinar if you have any technical issues in your taskbar. And you can also use the taskbar for our Q&A portion at the end of the webinar. So a little bit about NCAPA is we are a coalition of 35 national organizations that serve to represent the interests of the greater Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander community. And we are providing a voice for AA and HPI issues. We're primarily focused on influencing policy and shaping public narrative. NCAPA is comprised of these 5 policy committees, which are civil and human rights, education, health, housing and economic justice, and immigration. Members of our Education Committee include OCA, Asian Pacific American Advocates, the Asian Pacific American Labor Alliance, APALA, the Southeast Asia Resource Action Center, CRAC, the Asian Pacific Islander American Scholarship Fund, the Japanese American Citizens League, the Council for Native Hawaiian, and we're co-chaired by Apollo and CRAC. And today's webinar is going to cover what the federal law currently says about assessments and what are the new proposed regulations for assessments. So to give us an overview, I'm going to turn it over to Suvan from CRAC.
Thank you, Mary, for that quick introduction. Yeah, hi, everyone. So today we just wanted to talk a little bit about assessments and help prepare some of you, if you're interested in submitting some public comments for assessments that are due very soon here. So what are assessments? More commonly, these are known as tests among many of us. And there's a difference between federal and state and local requirements. A lot of, essentially all of these are administered by your local school districts, but for all varying reasons. Yeah, so these are just some of the examples of the tests that we'll touch on. Common Core, the NAEP, and the one in the middle of that photo is a state test from Minnesota. So I think one thing that is important to note is that there is not a federal test that will determine whether or not students graduate from high school. There's not a national test run by the federal government that determines whether or not you get into college. There are college entrance exams like the ACTs and SATs, but those are not required to be taken, and those are not administered by public schools. Common Core tests are also not national tests. I just wanted to dispel a myth there. And then we have what's called the National Assessment of Education Progress test. It's NAEP for short. And one key thing there to note is that it's not, it's a snapshot of how well our students are doing. Not all students take this test. It's actually just a statistically representative size of students that take this, and it just measures how well our nation's students are performing academically. So those are a lot of the national tests. From a state and local perspective, these are the tests that are created by state departments of organizations, these determine whether or not these students graduate. Your students graduate from high school. They are also part of the state accountability plans to make sure that they are, or to make sure that they're ensuring all of your students are making academic progress, and these are also all submitted to the Department of Education. Yeah, so one specific example, Minnesota uses what's called the Minnesota Comprehensive Assessment Test. So this same test is used to measure Minnesota students' academic progress towards the academic standards that Minnesota sets and creates. Okay, Minnesota sets all these, and it's to make sure that they also set legislative requirements. And students also take this test to determine whether or not they graduate from high school. Now, not all states use the same test for measuring academic progress and graduation. Minnesota happens to use the same test. So each state is done a little differently. In the context of this new law of ESSA, ESSA also gives states the power to choose which test to give students to measure the student achievement and growth. So this, whatever test these states want to. So they have that flexibility. So as on a more local level, in talking about test administration, so St. Paul Public School District is one of the largest in Minnesota, and the school district, they help administer all of the tests that are required by the federal and state laws. Yeah, sometimes local schools and school districts administer interim tests just to sort of anticipate how well they think students will perform on the actual test that will be taken later on in the year. And then there are just also some other tests that local school districts want to use for their own policies and purposes. So the St. Paul Public School District administers a cognition test. So that's not necessarily required by federal law or state law, but it's something that they want to do as part of their plans. And sometimes these tests are also used to inform instruction, but they're not necessarily required. One more thing to note on assessments too, they can also take different forms. Not all assessments or tests are multiple choice. These can be in the form of essays, these can be in the form of on computers, and more recently they're using computer adaptive tests. And now I'd like to turn it over to our colleagues from OCA Asia Pacific American Advocates to talk about the importance of assessments.
Thank you, Suban. Hello, everyone. Again, my name is Kim Hall, and I'm the Civil Rights Fellow at OCA Asian Pacific American Advocates. So assessments have important implications for our community. For instance, in some states, test scores are disaggregated by ethnicity, English learner status, migrant status, and other factors based on significantly present populations in the district or state. Because of this level of disaggregation, assessments are tools that measure the proficiency of subgroups at a level not possible otherwise. An example of this is looking at the results from the Minnesota Comprehensive Assessment. As you can see on the chart, so not only is the percentage of students proficient for Asian Americans listed, but it is disaggregated into South Asian, Chinese, Vietnamese, Cambodian, Lao, Hmong, and Burmese. And looking at this data, we are able to identify a 40-point gap between South Asian and Hmong. And with this data, school districts know to pay special attention to particular AAPI communities. So assessment data is important for the AAPI community. Therefore, the establishment of the 95% participation rate is key in making sure there is sufficient data available from standardized tests. So the No Child Left Behind established a 95% testing threshold for all students and subgroups to increase school accountability. So these subgroups included the 5 major ethnic groups, such as American Indian, Asian, Hispanic, Black, and White, limited English proficiency, special education, migrant status, and free and reduced price lunch. But before No Child Left Behind, schools across the country routinely excluded groups of students from testing in order to inflate their overall performance, because there was just a general 95% participation rule that applied to the entire student population. And exclusion took form in teachers requesting students from certain groups, such as students with disabilities or English learners, to stay home on the days of the test. So ESSA actually maintains the 95% testing threshold for all students and the subgroups. Which leads us to the opt-out movement. So the opt-out movement is a parent-led opposition to standardized testing by requesting to the school that their child not participate in testing. And this happens to be gaining traction in many states across the country. For example, in 2015, 20% of students opted out of the standardized state test in New York State. Proponents of the opt-out movement are concerned of the high-stakes nature of the test and questions surrounding the effectiveness of the data collected, but opponents of the opt-out movement say that assessments are essential in identifying achievement gaps between subgroups and areas for growth. But we encourage you not to opt out.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Kim. Now, I'm Rita Pena-Ahrens, Director of Education Policy at CRAC, and I'm going to talk to you about what's in the new regulations for assessment. So in terms of the regulations, first I want to go over that there is a current process where you are allowed to submit some comments on what has been negotiated for assessment. These comments are due September 9th. I've provided the docket ID number here. So if you were to put that into your internet browser, then this particular regulations would come up and you're able to then submit comments on them. There's also a link here for you to be able to look at the exact text of the regulations as well as the notice on the Federal Register. So let's first go over testing and what has not changed in the law. And Suvan and Kim have covered some of this, but I want to go into a little bit more detail. In terms of what hasn't changed from No Child Left Behind to the Every Student Succeeds Act, we still have annual testing in math and reading language arts in grades 3 through 8 and once in high school. In addition, there's still a science test that must happen once every grade span. That means once in elementary school, once in middle school, and once in high school. Now, states and districts that receive federal funds, which are the Title I-A funds, still have to administer the NAEP in grades 4 and 8 for reading, math, and science. Now, there's been a lot of controversy about test scores and whether tests are too high stakes. And we want to note that test scores still matter. They are still in the state accountability system. However, there are other measures in the state accountability system. And if you're interested in those other measures, please refer to our first webinar in our ESSA series, which goes into detail on some of the other measures that are covered. Also, I want to note that states and districts must provide disaggregated data on test results for low-income students, students with disabilities, English language learners, and students in the major racial and ethnic groups. In ESSA, states are also encouraged to provide disaggregated API data, but they do not have to. We can go on to the next slide. So what is new in ESSA? Well, first, as Suvan mentioned, there is flexibility with how annual assessments are done. It used to be that states would give an end-of-year assessment, and that would be the score that was used in their state accountability system. Now, states have the flexibility to use a single end-of-year assessment or give multiple assessments during the year that have to add up to one single summative score. In addition, computer adaptive assessments are allowed. Now, this doesn't just mean tests that are administered on the computer. It means that these tests, the questions will actually change depending on how the student performs. And this allows schools to really pinpoint how strong a student is in a particular subject or where they really need additional work. Second thing that I want to bring up is that districts can now opt out of using the state assessment. There is an option for a district to select a nationally recognized assessment that they can use instead of the state assessment. This has to be done with the state's approval and also has to include public stakeholder support. There is also a 1% cap on alternative assessments for students with the most severe cognitive disabilities. This has been a guideline in the past, but was never enforced. With ESSA, we now have flagged that there is concern that there is an over-identification of students with the most severe cognitive disabilities who are given assessments that have different standards and that may impact whether they receive a regular high school diploma. A lot of these students tend to be English language learners or come from specific racial and ethnic backgrounds. And so there's concern about the misidentification and over-identification of certain subsets of students. One exciting new thing, I think, for our population is that how well English language learners are learning English, or you'll see this in the regulations phrased as English language proficiency, is now part of state accountability systems and will be publicly reported both at the state level and at the local level. So you will be able to see, is your local school doing well by English language learners in teaching them how to read, write, and speak English. Another exciting piece, I think, for our communities is that states can now receive technical assistance from the federal government for developing assessments in a language other than English. This is referred to in the regulations as native language assessments. What this means is that if there is perceived to be a need within the state, then the state can develop, for example, a Chinese language assessment in reading or math. Or they could develop a Cambodian language assessment. I also want to note that there is an opportunity within the law for 7 states to create what are called competency-based assessment pilots. These are different types of testing that focus on specific student skills and performance tasks, but only 7 states across the country are allowed to run these pilots. Okay, now let's go into details on the regulations. So of particular note, I think, are the regulations around recent arrivals to the United States. These are students who have been in the U.S. and enrolled in a school for less than a year. The regulations specify that they do not have to take the state's language arts test in the first year. They have the option of opting out that very first year. If they do choose to take the state's language arts assessment, they can take the assessment in their native language, if it's available, for up to 3 years. And this is where that technical assistance piece is really important. If your state has a large number of refugees from a certain country, then it's an advocacy area where you can ask for the state to develop a test in that area to address the needs of that particular immigrant or refugee population. So those native language assessments that we've been talking about, the state has to identify the languages other than English that are present to a significant extent. That's the wording in the law. So the state uses its own criteria. However, within the regulations, it's specified that they have to choose at least the most populous language. However, practically, that typically means Spanish. So for our communities, we need to encourage states to use other criteria. The regulations do specify that states should consider 2 other criteria. One of them is languages spoken by distinct populations of English learners, particularly those who are migratory and not born in the United States or Native Americans. And also the other criteria that should be considered are languages spoken by a significant portion of the population in 1 or more districts or grade level. So if you can find groups of students in a particular school or district that you think has a significant language need, then draw that to the attention of the state to try to develop a native language assessment for them. Now, I think there's an exciting piece here for our Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander friends, and that is the regulations on Native American assessments. So for schools or programs taught primarily in a Native American language, students may use a native language assessment for reading and language arts until the end of their 8th grade year. And the definitions within the regulations for Native American include Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander communities. Please note that English language proficiency for these students must still be tested every year. There is a process for the school to go through that is done, a state approval process, but that is outlined in the regulations and can be referred to in the documents that I've linked you to. Now I want to go on to what I've mentioned before as the the district opt-out for nationally recognized assessment. When a district decides that they want to use a test that is different from the state designated test, then all the high school parents are notified of the district's request. Now this is important because if you are not quite in high school but entering high school, you may not get notified. So if you are the parent of a 7th or 8th grade student, then this decision doesn't necessarily get sent to you right away. In terms of what the district has to do is once they decide that they want to go this route, so for example, they may say, instead of taking the state math assessment, we want to use the advanced placement calculus exam for our district as a math test. Then the district has to provide an opportunity for public input. So a notification has to be sent to all parents of high school students and to all of the charter schools within that district that will be impacted. And in that notification, parents have to be told how they can provide feedback to the district as to whether they agree with the decision or not. There is opportunity for public input, and all of this feedback is presented to the state because the state has to make the final approval for whether the district can do this or not. And in addition, parents will be notified on any impact that the decision to go with a different test will have on classroom instruction and courses that are provided within the district. All right, next I want to speak a little bit about the advanced math exemptions. If you have an 8th grader that is in advanced math, the regulations specify that if they have an end-of-year exam, that your 8th grader can choose to take the high school exam instead of taking the exam that other 8th graders would take. So if they're in an advanced math class, it makes a little more sense for them to be taking the same exam that matches their course rather than their peers who are not in advanced math. I also want to point out an exciting part of the regulations that CIRAC actually helped negotiate, and that is that for parent negotiations, they must be, to the extent practicable, written in a language that a parent can understand, or if that's not possible, then an oral translation has to be provided to the school. So there may be times when a school pushes back and says they can't provide a written translation to you, but by law, you have the right to request an oral translation of that information, and the school must comply. So when are parents notified? I mean, that's an important question. Within the regulations, the new places where parents have to be notified is that they have to, of course, be given individual score reports for how their child performs on a state assessment. They have to also be notified when the district decides to use a different test than the state is using for math or language arts. And you have to be notified every year afterwards if the district continues to use that option. Parents also have to be notified when their student is identified as a student with a disability in two specific areas. One is if your child will be given accommodations on a test, so if they are given other tools that they can use during assessment, and there has to be an explanation for how those accommodations are used and whether it impacts the score. In addition, if your child is identified as being a child with a severe cognitive disability, you have to be informed about whether your child will take a test that is different from the other students who have disabilities, because this is considered an alternative assessment. And in some cases, it will impact whether your child receives their high school diploma on time and whether they receive a regular high school diploma. Now I'm going to turn it over to Monica Spade on submitting public comments.
Hi, I'm Monica Spade. I'm the Education Outreach and Field Director for CIRAC. And I'm just going to talk to you briefly about why you should submit public comments and the importance of that, kind of what happens to your comments, and why you should submit public comments. I think the most important reason is the Department of Education needs to hear your voice on issues that are important to our community. The department's gathering information to help formulate the best policy, and your voice helps them formulate the best policy for the community. And so without the community voice, they don't always get to know or hear and add into that policy that perspective. And your comment really can make a difference in the agency's decision making. Again, when you submit public comments, they are trying to formulate a really good policy, and your comments will really help with that decision making. So what happens to your comments after you submit them? So after you submit your comments, you're going to be provided with a tracking number so that you can review your comments, and after the agency has reviewed them, they're posted, and it's also attached with your name, and so you can actually search for your comment. All the information provided is public. So your comments are public. You can actually read them. Other people can read them. And the agency really makes their decision and conclusion on sound reasoning. It's not just about your thoughts or an opinion that you have, but it's really based on data, expert opinions, facts that's been accumulated during the rulemaking process. So it's really important that when you are submitting comments, that you're submitting comments that have good sound reasoning. If you have any data or any facts that you can actually submit, that's going to be very helpful in them reviewing that and actually using that when they're making their decision. Now, who can submit comments? Pretty much anyone can submit public comments. When there are agencies that were part of a negotiated rulemaking, such as CRAC, they are not able to provide comments on that section that they actually negotiated, but anyone can provide and submit comments. And so I would really encourage you that you, community members, organizations that you know, you can put your heads together and think about what's important with the regulations around assessments and really submit comments that will be helpful and meaningful, making sure that the issues our communities care about are included. The comments can be brief, they can be in-depth, they can address specific aspects of the rule, they can address all aspects, the subject at large. You know, you really have a large, wide landscape when you're submitting public comments. So again, any person, any group can comment on a rule, and it's easily submitted online. It's very easy, and we've included a link so that you guys can go. I think when Rita talked earlier, there was a link that a number that she gave you. You can actually search in Google and actually pull it up. So I'm encouraging you to submit those comments. So now we have a sample regulation and comment. And this proposed regulation is section 200.2, and it covers the state's responsibilities for assessments, including notification to parents at specific times. And it covers the legal guidelines for parent notification. And it just talks about, and I think Rita mentioned this earlier, notices to parents must be, to the extent practicable, written in a language that parents can understand, or if it is not practicable, to provide written translation to a parent with limited English proficiency, be orally translated for such parents. And beneath that, here's a sample comment for that proposed rule. Every written document in English sent to parents should also include information for how a parent can request free language assistance from the school or district. And it's really important to know that you don't have to write in what we call legalese or have to know legal terms. It's really important to know that you can use everyday plain English and submit public comments. It's not something that only attorneys can, or advocates or those who are working in the field have to, can submit or comment on, but anybody can provide public comments. And so for more comments on, for more information on submitting comments, we have a link also at the end for going to our previous webinars, which gives you more information. And here we go to the resources. And so we have some resources for you. We have the Every Student Succeeds Act and its relevancy to the API community. We have a link there for you to watch on YouTube. The department's page on the ESSA. And again, there's a link there for you, the overview of the assessments regulation. We included tips for submitting effective comment from regulations.gov. This is a really, really short, easy, one-page document that will really give you information, because it's not just about education. You can submit public comments on anything that's really affecting our community, and this document will help give you insight and guidance on doing that. And as I said earlier, you can go to CRAC.org, and there's a link for webinars and training, and you can find our webinars on ESSA, and particularly around public comment, and you can go there and you can actually watch those previous webinars, and I think it'd be really helpful for you. And feel free to share this with your networks, with other community-based organizations, families, friends, everybody that you can think that has a stake in education for our communities. I think it's important to share this information with. And if you're looking for recommendations or help, and you need a template, or you need us to help you with formulating your comments, or anything around this webinar, information about education advocacy, please send an email to education@CRAC.org with the subject sample ESSA comment, and then we will send you a link to our comments and templates and really help you out with that. And so please use this as a resource. This is not something you have to do alone. We are here to help you with that. I want to make sure that we can provide the information that you need.
Great. Thank you. And we've provided also information on how to contact us. So you can contact Conlaw from OCA National Advocates. Of course, my email is really simple. It's rita@CRAC.org. And also Suvan is suvan@CRAC.org. And Monica's is monica@CRAC.org. I hope you notice a pattern. Now, we're going to open it up to questions, and hopefully we will have the answer.
All right, and folks, just as a reminder, there's a taskbar, and near the bottom of that, there's an option for questions. We'll wait a few minutes here to sort of gather our questions, and then we'll come back and join you in a bit. Thank you. All right, one of our questions here is, when are these public comments due?
So public comments are, there are different deadlines for each of the regulations, but for the assessments regulations, they are due September 9th. So September 9th.
So in a few weeks. And we'll wait for a few more questions.
Hi, can someone who is submitting comments comment on something that is not explicitly discussed in the regulation?
So absolutely, as long as it's related to assessments, and as long as it would not violate any section of the law. So, for example, we did have folks who commented on particular philosophies that they thought should be prioritized with assessment as people are developing assessment.
So another question is it effective to submit public comments using like a template or form letter that you get from someone or some organization?
So you can use a template if you choose to, but I think it's really important to remember that they're making their decision on really sound argument, data, scientific facts, expert opinions. And so if you're submitting a form letter, the first thing you want to do is make sure that what's in the form letter is actually going to be substantive, that when the agency reads it, they can actually use it. If it's a form letter just to state your opinion and just to get a lot of numbers in the system, that's not as effective, and the agency's not going to take it, no matter how many letters you send, if it's not going to help with the argument of why you oppose or support the particular regulation.
Yeah. So that said, I think we've also seen certain cases where a very large amount of comments, even though they were very sort of short 1-2 sentence comments, were effective. So, for example, a number of years ago, for the Federal Communications Commission, when they were working through net neutrality, there were over 100,000 comments in support of it. That it was hard for the FCC to public, or at least the Commission as a whole, to publicly oppose the issue because you would be opposing such a vast amount of Americans and the desire. So I mean, with that specifically, it was around a set of principles. It was still sort of in line with sort of common guidelines, but as Monica mentioned, if you're only having like 20 folks sending things in, they shouldn't all use the exact same template. But if you're able to get like 20,000, that's not a bad idea.
Yeah, that's a good point. So what's your goal? Look at your numbers and then make sure the content has substance. And I think you could be fine either way.
I think it's also keeping in mind that we don't you don't need to be a policy expert. You are a community member, and you should have your concerns heard. And we also want to part of this webinar is helping to make sure that this process is as easy as possible and if that's accessible as possible. It's important to have your own unique stories or your own unique points to make your argument. So just keeping that in mind, and also making sure that your voice is heard.
So this is Rita. I just want to comment that you should not be afraid to just share your personal story. You don't have to have statistics. So for an example, if you wanted to have your state prioritize making a native language assessment in Cambodian, then you should talk about how difficult it might have been for you as a student in your school when you were first trying to learn English, and how having that language, that particular assessment in Cambodian would have helped you succeed better. And that is a perfectly legitimate comment and is considered valuable. Okay, we're just going to do a last call out for questions. So if you have a question, please type it in. Otherwise, we will close this up in about a minute.
So that is it for our third ESSA webinar. Please stay tuned for future webinars, and you can also view previous webinars at ncampaonline.org/education. Hope everyone has a great day.